The laughter stopped so fast, you could almost hear it crack. I had just asked Eduardo, in Spanish, in the same Colombian cadence I'd spent 4 years absorbing on job sites in Bogotá, whether he'd like me to pass the bread. 8 words. ¿Quieres que te pase el pan, Eduardo? That was all it took. My mother-in-law Carmen's hand went rigid around her wine glass. Rodrigo, seated across from me, went the kind of still that people go when they're suddenly recalculating everything. And my wife Lucia looked at me from the far end of the table, with an expression I'd never seen on her face before. Not anger, not guilt, but something that looked a lot like fear. I smiled, waited. ¿Hablas español? Eduardo finally said, barely above a whisper. Soy bastante fluido, I answered. Let me back up about 7 hours. My name is Paul Sheridan. I'm 47 years old, a petroleum engineer by trade, and I've lived in Houston for most of my adult life. I met Lucia Vargas at a charity gala 8 years ago. She was managing the event catering, her family's business, and she had this way of moving through a crowded room like she owned every square foot of it. I introduced myself twice before she noticed me. That should have told me something. We got married in 2019. Small ceremony, big reception. The Vargas family knows how to throw a party. Her parents Eduardo and Carmen had immigrated from Colombia in the late 90s and built Vargas Catering into one of the more respected names in Houston's event industry. Her brother Andres worked alongside them. They were close-knit the way some immigrant families are, where the family unit functions almost like a corporation. Everyone has a role. Everyone answers to Eduardo. I'd always been the outsider in that structure. Welcomed, sure, but the way a guest is welcomed, politely, with a fixed distance maintained. From nearly the beginning of my relationship with Lucia, the Vargas family spoke Spanish when they didn't want me following the conversation. They'd slip into it the way you slip into a second room. A laugh, a quick exchange, a lowered voice. Then back to English when they remembered I was there. What they didn't know, what Lucia herself didn't know, was that I'd spent 4 years in Bogotá and Cartagena working for an oil and gas company from 2011 to 2015. 4 years on Colombian job sites, in Colombian neighborhoods, eating in Colombian homes. I didn't just pick up conversational Spanish. I argued contracts in Spanish. I negotiated with subcontractors in Spanish. I understood jokes in Spanish, which is harder than it sounds. When Lucia and I got together, she mentioned her family spoke Spanish at home. I didn't bring up Bogotá. At first it just hadn't come up naturally. Then, as the months passed, I noticed the way her family used their language as a privacy room, and part of me, the part that had spent years reading rooms in a foreign country, decided not to announce it. Not yet. There was a night, about a year into dating Lucia, when I caught a fragment. Carmen and Andres were talking quietly in the kitchen. I heard Eduardo's name, and the word control, and something about El Americano. When they noticed me in the doorway, they stopped and smiled. We were just talking about a supplier, Carmen said. I smiled back, filed it away. Sometimes paranoia is just pattern recognition. Our son Marco was born in 2020. He's 5 now. The kind of kid who asks 18 questions before breakfast and gives hugs that are somehow too big for his body. Being his father is the best thing I've ever done. Whatever else has come apart in my life, Marco was the part that held. The dinner invitation came on a Wednesday. Lucia mentioned it over breakfast, not quite meeting my eyes. My parents are having some people over Saturday. Business friends, family. They want us there. Sure, I said. She seemed relieved. I noticed that too. Saturday arrived. I drove us out to the Vargas family home in Sugarland. A large brick colonial Eduardo had paid cash for in 2018, one of the fruits of a catering business that had grown well past its Van and Chafing Dishes origins. We arrived to find Eduardo and Carmen, Andres and his girlfriend, 2 couples I didn't recognize, and Rodrigo. Rodrigo Castillo had been appearing at Vargas family events for about a year. He'd been introduced to me as a family friend from Colombia, now living in Houston, working in import logistics. He was the kind of man who was very comfortable in rooms where he'd never been before. Good-looking in an easy, practiced way. He shook my hand too firmly. The dinner table sat 12. Tonight there were 9 of us. I was placed at one end, Lucia at the other, Eduardo and Carmen flanking her. Rodrigo sat across from me, between the 2 couples I didn't know. The first 40 minutes were fine. Dinner conversation, the catering business, Houston traffic, the Texan season, normal enough. Then gradually, it shifted. It starts that way. A short exchange in Spanish between Eduardo and Andres, a laugh between Carmen and one of the other women, then longer stretches, with quick English summaries, thrown my direction. We're just talking about the supplier situation, and then they'd forget about me again, and the Spanish would continue. I ate. I smiled when people looked at me. I asked Rodrigo to pass the salt. And I listened. The first thing I caught fully was Carmen to the woman beside her, in Spanish. He works constantly. He barely notices what's happening in his own house. The woman made a sympathetic sound. Poor man, she said, in a way that didn't sound like sympathy. I took a long sip of water. Then Eduardo, cutting his steak, said something to Andres in a low voice. The paperwork should be ready by next month. Lucia needs to be sure before we move. Andres answered, she's been sure for a long time. My jaw tightened. I buttered a piece of bread. And the house? Andres asked. Appraised last month, Eduardo said. 460. In this market she'll come out well. The lawyer says she has a strong claim for primary residence. She's been the primary caregiver. I coached Marco's soccer on Saturdays. I took him to the pediatrician when he had strep throat in February. I built him a bookshelf. I read to him every night I was home. Primary caregiver. I set down the butter knife. Rodrigo leaned toward Eduardo and said, quietly, but not quietly enough. She told me she's done waiting. She wants it settled before Marco starts first grade. So that was the timeline. Eduardo nodded. Better before summer. The longer it drags, the more complicated it gets. He glanced down the table toward me. I was looking at my plate, the picture of a man peacefully eating his dinner, understanding nothing. He turned back to Rodrigo. He trusts her completely. He won't see it coming. Carmen spoke up then. And Marco, you're ready for the transition? Rodrigo lifted his wine glass slightly, like a small toast. I've been ready. He's a good boy. He'll adjust. I looked up because I couldn't help it. For a half-second, Rodrigo's eyes met mine. He smiled politely, reached for his wine, looked away. He'll adjust. My 5-year-old who calls me daddy and still climbs into my lap during thunderstorms. Being handed to a man he barely knew, who was now sitting across from me, drinking Eduardo's wine, in a room full of people who had calculated, I wouldn't understand a single word they said. I took a slow breath. Carmen looked down the table and switched to English. Paul, you've been so quiet tonight. Are you not enjoying the food? This was the moment. I understood that clearly. I could deflect. I could excuse myself, drive home, and handle this the quiet way. The attorney's office on Monday. The controlled dismantling of a life. Or I could answer Carmen's question honestly. I set my fork down, picked up my wine glass, looked at her directly for the first time all evening. The food is excellent, Carmen, I said, in Spanish. Estaba pensando en lo mucho que puedes aprender sobre la gente con solo escuchar la conversación en la cena. I was just thinking about how much you can learn about people from listening to dinner conversation. The table went quiet, the way the world goes quiet right after a loud sound. ¿Quieres que te pase el pan, Eduardo? I added, turning to my father-in-law. Do you want me to pass the bread? The wine glass wobbled in Carmen's hand. She caught it, barely. Eduardo set down his fork with a sound that seemed far too loud. Rodrigo went very still. At the far end of the table, Lucia had both hands flat on the tablecloth, staring at me. Her face had the look of someone trying to remember how to breathe. ¿Hablas español? Eduardo finally said. Soy bastante fluido, I said. I lived in Bogotá for 4 years, worked there. Spent time in Cartagena too, actually. Beautiful city. Have you been back recently? He didn't answer. I switched to English, because I wanted everything that followed to land exactly right. I understood all of it, the appraisal, the attorney, the timeline, Rodrigo's readiness. I looked at Rodrigo. I appreciate that you're prepared for the transition. That's very organized. He said nothing. Paul Lucia's voice from the other end of the table, tight, strangled. I have one question, I said. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. How long? She knew what I was asking. 8 months, she said, after a silence that lasted long enough for me to count the seconds. 8 months. Marco had turned 5 8 months ago. We threw him a birthday party in the backyard with a bounce house, and too much blue frosting on the cake, and I thought I was happy, and apparently I was the only one at that party who was. I stood up. My chair scraped the tile floor. I'm leaving, don't come home tonight. Eduardo stood too. Paul, let's talk about this like men. You planned this at your dinner table while I was sitting right here, I said. We're past talking like men. I thanked Carmen for the meal. I meant it. It was genuinely a good meal. Then I walked to the front door, got in my truck, and pulled out of the driveway. I drove to a Buc-ee's off the highway and sat in the parking lot for a long time. The first call I made was to my college roommate Danny, who'd become a family attorney in Austin. Voicemail. Danny, it's Paul. I need the best divorce and custody attorney in Houston. Call me back. Second call was to my brother Sean in Dallas. I need you to know what's happening, in case things move fast. Third was to my firm's HR line for emergency leave. Then I sat there in a Buc-ee's parking lot at 9 on a Saturday night, surrounded by normal people buying beef jerky and giant sodas, and I tried to understand what my life was now. The attorney Danny referred me to was Helen Collier. She'd practiced family law in Harris County for 24 years, and had the particular calm of someone who has already heard the worst possible version of whatever you're about to say. I met her Monday morning. She listened without interrupting while I laid out everything. No recording, she said when I finished. No recording. A pause. You're on Marco's birth certificate? Yes. Consistent presence as a caregiver? I'd say 50-50 on day-to-day. I travel occasionally for work, but I'm there most mornings, most nights. I do school pickups. His pediatrician knows me by name. She wrote something down. In Texas, custody is determined by the best interest of the child. Courts look at the history of care, the stability of each parent, the existing bond. Your history is strong. She set down her pen. The financial piece, anything signed yet? Not yet. They mentioned paperwork coming next month. Then we file first today if we can. We document assets and request a freeze on any transfers. She looked at me steadily. You understood that dinner conversation completely? Every word. Then you can testify to it under oath. Your testimony isn't a recording, but it carries real weight when it's consistent with other evidence. The attorney Eduardo had already contacted. The timeline, Rodrigo's presence, we can build a picture. Lucia came home Sunday morning. She'd taken Marco to her parents overnight, which she'd done before, which I'd never questioned. She stood in the kitchen doorway. She looked like she hadn't slept. You never told me you spoke Spanish, she said. You never asked. Paul, how long was it going to be before you told me yourself? She looked at the wall. I kept thinking I'd end it, then I kept not ending it. And the house. The paperwork your father mentioned. She flinched. I didn't know the details of that. That was Eduardo being. Eduardo, I said. Right. I don't want this to be a fight about Marco. Then you should have thought about that 8 months ago. The legal process was, as Helen promised, not fast and not clean. Lucia's attorney filed a response within 2 weeks claiming I'd been emotionally distant and that Lucia had been the true primary caregiver. Helen responded with documentation. 4 years of school records listing me as primary contact, pediatric visit records, a letter from Marco's soccer coach, time-stamped photos. We also filed discovery on the financial planning discussed at dinner. Eduardo's business attorney pushed back hard. When Helen made clear we were prepared to subpoena records and depose Eduardo, Carmen, and Rodrigo under oath about the dinner conversation and the property appraisal, the posturing softened considerably. Rodrigo had no interest in being deposed. He made that very clear through his own attorney. The first custody hearing was in November. I sat in a Harris County courtroom in a suit I'd bought for Marco's baptism, and listened to Lucia's attorney describe me as a man who had chosen his career over his family. Helen let them finish. Then she put on 20 minutes of evidence. She ended with this. Your Honor, Mr. Sheridan has been present, engaged, and consistent in his son's life from the day Marco was born. We ask that Marco's primary residence remain with his father to preserve the stability he currently has. The judge looked at Lucia's attorney. What specifically does your client point to in support of the primary caregiver claim? The answer was mostly vague. The judge's expression didn't change, but I saw something sharpen behind his eyes. Temporary primary custody went to me. Lucia received visitation 3 days a week. Walking out of that courthouse, Helen gripped my arm briefly. Strong result, Paul. We're well positioned. I nodded. It didn't feel like a win. It felt like standing on the bank of a river after most of the bridge had washed out. The final hearing was in February. Eduardo appeared as a witness. Under cross-examination, Helen asked him directly about the Saturday dinner. He denied any planning had been discussed. Helen pointed out that his phone records showed calls to a Houston family law firm on 3 consecutive days the week before that dinner. He called it coincidence. The judge found Eduardo's testimony not credible. 4 words in a longer ruling, 4 important words. Primary custody to me. Lucia received alternating weekends and 1 weeknight per week. Child support based on the income differential between us. The house went through equitable division. I bought Lucia out at fair market value. She moved into an apartment in Midtown. Rodrigo, last I heard, relocated to Miami. The months that followed were their own kind of hard. Explaining to a 5-year-old that mommy lives somewhere else now. Finding a new routine. Learning that single parenting isn't a state you adapt to once, and you're finished. It's something you relearn every week, because the kid keeps changing, and what worked last month doesn't work this month. My mother drove down from Tennessee for the first few months, and helped me find my footing. A coworker of mine and his wife had us over for dinner twice a month, so Marco could play with their kids, and I could eat a meal I didn't cook and talk to adults. Small things, but small things are sometimes everything. Lucia exercises her visitation consistently. She's a good mother when she's present, and I don't say anything different to Marco. He loves her. He should love her. My job is not to make him choose. My job is to make sure he's safe, and that he knows without a shred of doubt that I am here, and that I will always be here. He asked me once, about 3 months after everything changed, whether I was sad about mommy. I thought about how to answer that for a moment. Then I said, I'm a little sad about some things, but I'm really, really happy that I get to be your dad every day. He thought about that for a second. Then he went back to his Legos. There are things I wish I'd done differently. I wish I'd paid attention sooner to the things I told myself not to notice. The phone she kept screened down on the counter. The Saturday afternoons with girlfriends that came home, smelling like a restaurant I'd never been to. The Christmas at the Vargas house last year that felt different. Too many glances exchanged. Too much warmth directed at a man who had been introduced to me as a family friend. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was being the kind of controlling, suspicious husband who suffocates a marriage. I bent so far in the opposite direction that I left a gap wide enough to lose nearly everything. Trust your instincts, not the anxious spiraling kind, but the quiet one, the one that says something is off. That one is usually right. Document what matters. Not because you're preparing for war, but because a paper trail of your presence in your child's life is also just a record of love. Dates, photos, school emails sent from your address, pediatrician visits you attended. If those records ever need to be something else, they're already there. Get help without shame. I almost didn't call Danny that night. I was embarrassed in a way that's hard to explain. Like not seeing this coming meant I was stupid, and stupid men don't deserve help. That's nonsense. Asking for help when your life has come apart is not a sign that you failed. It is the only rational response available. And then there's the thing I've thought about the most in the 1.5 years since that dinner. Being a father is not about a birth certificate or a bloodline, or who is biologically entitled to what. It's about the 6 a.m. Saturday mornings, with cartoons and cereal. It's about knowing which stuffed animal he cannot sleep without. It's about sitting in the urgent care waiting room at midnight, more scared than you've been about anything in your adult life, while a nurse checks his breathing. It's about showing up, every day, especially the boring days. I've started teaching Marco Spanish. He thinks it's hilarious when I speak it, laughs every time, like it's a trick I'm performing. He's picked up words to surprise his grandparents, which is a complicated family situation I'm choosing not to overthink. The point is he's learning. He'll have something I didn't get until my 20s, and he'll have it because we turned a terrible thing into something useful. Someday, when he's old enough, I'll tell him the whole story. The dinner table. The Spanish I kept secret without quite knowing why. The moment I spoke and watched the room change. How being underestimated, completely and confidently underestimated, turned out to be the thing that saved us both. But right now he's calling me from the backyard because he found what he is absolutely certain is the world's biggest beetle, and he needs me to come look immediately. That's my cue. Some things don't need any translation at all.